The Protestant Reformation, the doctrine of two kingdoms, secularism, and the nation state. This is a sort of a subchapter. There is a general consensus among most scholars that the concept of a nation state, as has been understood since the late 19th century and early 20th centuries, may be traced to the Peace of Westphalia, entered into on 24th October 1648, which ended the 30 Years' War in Europe after 5 years of negotiations. But what was the 30 Years' War all about? What led to it? Was it a secular war, or did it have a distinctly and predominantly religious hue? If yes, which religion? How did the Peace of Westphalia lead or contribute to colonialism and coloniality? Prior to the advent of the Westphalian state, the Christian Commonwealth, or the Christian Republic, Republica Christiana, or simply Christendom, existed in Europe, wherein power was distributed between the Pope, the bishops, the Holy Roman Emperor, princes of states and nobles who thought of themselves as being part of the Christian civilization. Pertinently, while there were states and rulers, they operated under the umbrella of the Pope and the Emperor, which for all practical purposes made them feudal principalities. Starting from at least 1517 CE, if you don't follow current history, 1517 CE means 1517 AD. It's now called Common Era as opposed to Anno Domini. Starting from at least 1517 CE, that is over 100 years before the Peace of Westphalia, resistance to the Catholic Church led by pastor theologians Martin Luther, German, and John Calvin, French, known as the Protestant Reformation, had begun, owing to the abuse of papal authority and the absolute control of the Catholic priesthood over Christianity. The nature of the challenge posed to papal authority needs to be understood at a deeper level in order to appreciate the true impact of Protestant oity. Oity means ontology, epistemology, theology. The true impact of Protestant oity on the Peace of Westphalia and the Westphalian nation-state system with its attendant trappings that were later imposed upon colonized societies. The nature of the Protestant Reformation warrants understanding, especially from the perspective of Bharat, for yet another critical reason. Its anti-clericalism was exported by the colonizer to the colonized indigenous societies as well. In other words, all the ills, real and perceived, associated by the Protestant Reformation with the Roman Catholic Church were subsequently projected onto those classes of people in the colonized societies, who, according to the reformed colonizer, occupied the same position as the Catholic Church. In the case of Bharat, as we shall see in the second section of the book, Brahmins and Brahminism were the subject of this reformative approach. Therefore, the ensuing portion, which deals with the thought behind the Protestant Reformation, must be paid attention for more reasons than one. On this subject, Dr. Jacob de Roover's book, Europe, India, and the Limits of Secularism, is deeply educative. But before I go into the details of his work, I will digress a little to address something that affects the larger issue of openness to scholarship that questions the so-called secular and neutral premise of contemporary institutions. De Roover's work is piercing and rigorous in this regard, and yet has unfortunately not received the kind of attention in Bharat that it ought to have, given that the subject of his scholarship is the specific impact of European secularism on Bharat. What makes his work a must-read is his examination of the theological underpinnings of both the Reformation and the Enlightenment. The tendency to ignore his work and that of other scholars who share his position, in my opinion, is indicative of the larger unspoken stifling of decolonial thought and scholarship in Bharat, because it has the potential to upset the status quo on several fronts in favor of the Indic civilization perspective, an issue I address in greater detail in the second section. Therefore, wherever I believe a certain work has not received its due in Bharat despite its manifest relevance, I have consciously chosen to discuss it at length as opposed to merely referencing it in the hope of greater dissemination of important decolonial scholarship such as that of de Roover. Coming to this book, de Roover sheds light on the Protestant politico-theological framework behind the distinction that the modern nation-states, including those formerly colonized, make between the spiritual and the temporal or secular. According to him, this distinction significantly informed the Protestant Reformation, which started in the 16th century. His view is that the liberal model of religious toleration and secularism, which continues to have purchase in the West and in decolonized states, is based on the specific theological framework that was conceptually conceived of during the Protestant Reformation. He calls it the crystallization of the political theology of Christian freedom and the two kingdoms. His insights on this subject and the nexus that he unearths between the political theology arising from the Protestant Reformation and the very definition of what it means to be a Christian are profound and extremely relevant for decolonized societies that have inherited the European political structure. His work is an essential reading, in my opinion, especially for indigenous societies, for them to become aware of the patently non-secular context of the modern distinction between the spiritual and the secular, because it calls out the claim of neutral application of values such as secularism, which have been inherited from the colonizer. According to de Roover, to appreciate the true nature of secularization of Christianity achieved by and through the Protestant Reformation, one must understand what the specific object of Reformation was. This requires us to delve briefly into the Roman Catholic ontology, epistemology, theology prior to the Protestant Reformation, and more specifically into the process of conversion. Today, while conversion in the context of Christianity is synonymous with proselytization of non-Christians in order to bring them into the Christian fold, the very first people who underwent conversion were the Christians themselves. The process of conversion, however, refers to a structured spiritual regimen that was evolved in the medieval age by Christian monks in monasteries who were distinct from the clergy to achieve a true Christian life of absolute submission to God. Submission to the Creator meant obedience and sacrificing individual purpose at the altar of the divine purpose. The specific goal of the process was to reform man in the image of God, for which he must overcome the original sin that stood in the way of such reformation. In practice, the process of conversion divided both human beings and the world. In practice, the process of conversion divided both human beings and the world into two realms, namely the spiritual and the temporal. The temporal world was given a shelf life until the second coming of Christ, whereas the spiritual was eternal. Until the second coming, the obligation of a true Christian was to constantly work towards overcoming the desires of the flesh, so as to make the spirit and body more spiritual. This meant that the process of conversion towards the object of reformation was a never-ending one for two reasons. First, the original sin, so to speak, quote-unquote original sin, was too seductive to overcome, and therefore human beings would assuredly fail, thereby reinforcing their status as wretched sinners. And second, this process had to continue until the second coming. The silver lining, if any, of this never-ending process of conversion was that the degree of conversion achieved in this world would determine the extent of freedom conferred in the next world. Importantly, those who had submitted themselves fully to God were beyond the reach of human authorities and hence free from their control. Not only were they free from the restrictions imposed by any earthly authority, their submission to God gave them the ability to resist the desires of the flesh. However, in order to achieve complete submission to God and total freedom from secular authorities, faith in Christ was the only way, since Christ had received divine grace. Without such grace, humans were themselves incapable of resisting the seductive lure of sin. Simply put, according to Catholic belief, for all humans, Christ was the only way to reach God. In the medieval age, various Christian monastic orders that revolved around the institutionalization of this process of conversion influenced the church significantly. Since these Christian monastic orders had dedicated their entire lives to the achievement of this divine purpose through rigorous practice, their supposedly exalted spiritual position, according to them, also gave them power over the earthly society and secular authority in order to convert them. The church, being alive to the austerities of monks, absorbed them as bishops or elevated them to positions of leadership within the church. The consequence of this nexus between monastic orders and the church was the pursuit of reformation of the society in the image of the monastic community. De Roover has referred to this milestone as the monasticization of the church, and therefore Christendom itself. Given the proliferation of monastic orders, their rules and practices, and their manifest impact on the reform of the church between the 10th and 12th centuries, the rules followed within the various monasteries were rationalized in the interest of uniformity and preserving the rigor of the process of conversion for reformation. The next phase was the division of the spiritual realm between the monks and the priests of the church, since monastic orders had not fully merged with the church. However, The influence of the monastic orders on the church led to the morphing of priesthood to mirror the rigors of a monastic life, which involved the four-stage process of vocation, reform, conversion, and purification. Since monks and their way of life were exemplified as truly Christian by the church, a hierarchy of sorts was created among the subjects of God, with monks occupying the top position, followed by the clergy, the earthly secular rulers, and finally the laity, the lay believers. The order was a function of submission to God. The greater and more complete the submission, the greater the freedom from earthly authority, and the higher the station occupied on earth as well as in the next world. Critically, there was an allocation of worlds between the monks and the clergy. The monks would lead the rest of the flock in the other world, the church and its clergy would lead the flock, including the rulers, in the earthly world, akin to shepherds. In effect, the priests became conduits to salvation and God, since they were the true servants of God. This is the essence of the Christian doctrine, extra ecclesiam nulla salus. All salvation is through Christ, and Christ can be reached only through the church, and therefore there is no salvation outside the church. Given its penultimate station in the spiritual hierarchy in the earthly world, the church was regarded as the soul, while kings were the body. Naturally, the church, the soul, which was deemed superior to the body, took it upon itself to preserve order in the earthly world and assumed an advisory role to the body, that is, the earthly rulers, on all matters both religious and secular. This effectively turned Christianity into a religion of the priests and the entirety of Christendom into the fiefdom of the church, which freed the church from scrutiny of any form of earthly authority and secured for it overlordship over earthly authority. The other less lofty objective was to secure complete proprietal ownership of the church, which was the property of the temporal rulers or kings until the 11th century. According to de Roover, what helped the church in making a case for its freedom from all forms of secular dominion was the fact that the separation of the spiritual and the secular was essential to Christianity itself and its understanding of human existence from the very beginning. In fact, the distinction was traceable to a combined reading of specific chapters and verses of the King James Bible, namely John 18:36, "My kingdom is not of this world," Luke 10:20, and Mark 12:17. Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. What is to be discerned from this history is that the distinction between the secular and the spiritual was drawn from within the Christian framework and not outside of it. The sum and substance of this distinction was elaborated as follows by Hugh of St. Victor in De Sacramentis Christianae Fidei. There are two lives, one earthly, the other heavenly, one corporeal, the other spiritual. By one the body lives from the soul, by the other the soul lives from God. Each has its own good by which it is invigorated and nourished so that it can subsist. The earthly life is nourished with earthly goods, the spiritual life with spiritual goods. To the earthly life belong all things that are earthly, to the spiritual life all goods that are spiritual. Among laymen, to whose zeal and forethought the things that are necessary for earthly life pertain, the power is earthly. Among the clergy, to whose office the gods, the English is very weird, I can't help. Among the clergy, to whose office the goods of the spiritual life belong, the power is divine. The one power is therefore called secular, the other spiritual. Clearly, the divide between the spiritual and the secular was not outside the scope of Christian oity. In fact, de Roover categorically states that without the support of a cluster of Christian theological notions, soul and body, the earthly and the spiritual life, divine power and the kingdom of Christ, and so on, this distinction would dissolve into thin air. Consequently, neither term, spiritual nor secular, when used in the context of contemporary nation-states, must be divorced from the Christian origins in which they are embedded. De Roover goes as far as to say that the metes and bounds of the spiritual and the secular realms were determined on the basis of Christian oity, ontology, epistemology, theology, Christian ontology, epistemology, theology, over which the Roman Catholic Church had the final word. Let me drink some tea. Given that the freedom enjoyed by the church translated to freedom to prevail over earthly rulers as well, it expectedly led to strained relations between the Roman Catholic Church, headed by the Pope and earthly authorities. Even the common people, the lowest in the spiritual hierarchy of Christianity, resented the sanctimonious intervention of a hierarchically organized Catholic Church in all facets of life. The constant sermons to overcome sin and to repent for it contributed to a general distrust of the Christian clergy, while their own ability to rise above the very sin they preached against was called into question. Ironically, this did not translate to loss of faith in Christianity. Instead, the lay believers organized themselves in private groups to circumvent the overarching influence of the church and drew inspiration instead from the monastic orders that had influenced the church itself. However, since it was impossible for the lay believer to observe all the rigors of a monastic life, the process of conversion for which the monastic orders had been created spilled over into the society and acquired a life of its own, thereby inching towards the Protestant Reformation. De Roover calls it the monasticization of daily life, which prepared the ground for a confrontation with the Roman Catholic Church. After all, the Church's monopoly over sin and penitence was being seriously undermined owing to the secularization, rather de-churchification of conversion and reform, the very pillars of Christian belief, the raison d'être of the Church. What made matters worse for the Church was the fact that people were willing to believe the accounts and stories of lecherous priests, and the Church itself began to be seen as the biggest obstacle to the practice of true Christian faith. No longer were the Church and its clergy seen as the sole conduits to God, nor were they treated as exclusive or special beneficiaries of divine grace. This empowered the lay believer's ability to pursue his or her own faith through individual and direct submission to God without any form of ecclesiastical intercession. This was the bedrock of the approach of the Protestant Reformation to Christianity. To digress on a related note, those who are familiar with the origins of anti-Brahmin attitudes in Bharat after the arrival of the European colonizer would be able to draw parallels between the Protestant Reformation's grievances with the Roman Catholic Church and the projection of a similar grievance onto institutions, practices and groups in Bharat that were seen as Brahminical. As we shall see in the next section, the Protestant lens led the Christian European colonizer to treat Buddhism, Jainism and Sikhism as reformative movements that challenged Brahminism. In other words, even the history of indigenous religious developments within the dharmic fold were reimagined on Protestant lines and presented as historical facts. Contributing to the Protestant Reformation through their writings, Martin Luther and John Calvin democratized the spiritual process of conversion beyond the monastic and papal echelons. In 1520, Luther wrote in Freedom of a Christian that the book is called Freedom of a Christian. Luther wrote in Freedom of a Christian that faith alone was sufficient for salvation, and faith made the believer free from human laws and obligations. Luther and other reformers argued that faith in the divinity and divine itself was the result of the will of God acting through the Holy Spirit without the need for channels like the church, its clergy or the monks. The reformers opposed the tyranny of papacy and its monopoly over conversion and freedom from laws. Consequently, according to the reformers, no one was a priest and everyone was a priest, which led to the deeper percolation of Christianity in society. The reformers went a step further and argued that if submission to God made monks and priests free from earthly rulers and laws, the same principle would apply to lay believers as well if they too could achieve spiritual conversion to the same degree as monks and priests. However, perhaps they realized that this could put them in direct confrontation with the authority of secular rulers, apart from plunging the society into anarchy and chaos. Therefore, the theory of two kingdoms was formulated, with biblical support of course, by both Luther and Calvin, who struck a distinction between Christ's spiritual kingdom and the temporal kingdom of earth, where secular authorities held sway. It postulated that Christians enjoyed freedom in the spiritual sphere while being required to obey the secular laws of temporal rulers, to the extent that the latter did not encroach upon their faith. The caveat to this position was that true Christians were free from all human laws, similar to the view held by monks and priests, except that this freedom was previously limited under the Catholic position to those belonging to the spiritual estate, namely the monks and the priests themselves. In contrast, since the reformers rejected the authority of the Catholic Church, its clergy and the monks, all true Christians were entitled to freedom entitled to freedom from human laws if the process of conversion was complete and submission to God was undiluted. Further, the reformers rejected all the spiritual laws laid down by the Roman Catholic Church as false religion designed to oppress the lay believers. The bottom line was that, according to the reformers, no human had the power to lay down spiritual laws, since even they were ultimately human laws with nothing spiritual about them. Specifically, Calvin claimed that the kingdom of Christ was invaded by the so-called spiritual laws created by the Roman Catholic Church, which oppressed the freedom given by Christ to the conscience of the believers. Here, it is hard to miss the reference to the freedom of conscience, which has become part of the discourse on religious freedom in civilized nations, namely the colonizing as well as the colonialized nations. The theory of two kingdoms was in several ways the precursor to the present-day doctrine of separation of the church and state, since both Luther and Calvin put forth the view that temporal authority could extend only to the affairs of the earth and never entered the spiritual sphere, which was the exclusive preserve of God, the fount of all things spiritual. However, contrary to the contemporary assumptions of the modern state being a secular entity, Protestant reformers were of the clear view that the state too was a divine order whose existence was necessary to prevent people from following an immoral path, since as sinners they were fundamentally prone to depravity without an external check. In other words, the apparatus of the state was a Christian necessity to enforce Christian morality through instrumentality of the law, with the church and the state working together to fulfill their respective biblically ordained Christian obligations. What this proves is that the irreligious or secular nature that is imputed to a modern nation state owing to its observance of the policy of separation of the church and state is completely ahistorical and baseless. This is because the history of the Protestant Reformation is clear in that the political theology of the two kingdoms upon which the policy is based was strongly rooted in Christian beliefs and functioned entirely within the Christian framework. It was a conversion happening within the Christian society, and therefore any present-day discussion on separation of the church and the state is incapable of being supported by assumptions outside the fold of Christianity. De Roover makes it abundantly clear that a secular government in terms of the Protestant Reformation is nothing but a Christian secular government without any conflict or logical inconsistency, given its clear Christian origins. Former colonies, the current-day decolonized nations, must bear this in mind before parroting the secularized, received Christian wisdom behind secularism. Coming back to the Protestant Reformation, thanks to direct attacks by the reformers on the Roman Catholic Church, its legal idolatry, corruption and the abuse of power, the Edict of Worms was issued in 1521 by the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V at the behest of Pope Leo X. The edict banned the propagation of Lutheran ideas, condemned its followers and excommunicated Luther himself as a notorious heretic. Naturally, this disturbed the uneasy peace of the previous years, and the next few decades saw the spread of the Reformation, particularly radical Reformation, across Europe with increasingly armed reactions from the Catholic Church. However, apart from the antipathy between Catholicism and the Reformation movement, the relationship between Lutherans and Calvinists too was schismatic. After over 3 decades of the edict in 1555, when both the Lutheran and Calvinist forms of Protestantism held sway over vast swaths of Europe, the Peace of Augsburg, or the Augsburg Settlement, was entered into between the Catholic and the Lutheran sides, which resulted in the permanent recognition of Lutheranism as a valid Christian denomination alongside Roman Catholicism. This gave the rulers or princes of states within the Holy Roman Empire the freedom to choose one of the two denominations under the principle of cuius regio, eius religio, which translated to whose realm, his religion. Effectively, the Augsburg Settlement had the historic consequence of allowing each state within the empire to determine its Christian denominational identity, which laid the foundation for sovereign states in Europe and marked the beginning of the decline of the Holy Roman Empire. However, Calvinism was still not recognized by the Augsburg Settlement, which made the Peace of Augsburg a shaky one and sowed the seeds for the coming strife, namely the 30 Years' War. It must be appreciated that prior to the advent of the Protestant Reformation, religion, specifically that of the Catholic Church, the papal authority and the holy status of the Roman Emperor bound the Christian empire together despite differences in political and economic goals of the principalities within the empire. While the Reformation may have loosened their bonds to the Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Empire, contrary to popular perception, their bonds to Christianity were not broken. In fact, the Peace of Augsburg is proof of freedom of religion within the Christian fold, with each state or principality within the empire claiming for itself a state denomination of Christianity, namely either Roman Catholicism or Lutheranism. However, matters precipitated when in 1608 the Protestant Union was set up after the Imperial Diet, the deliberative body of the Holy Roman Empire, failed to formally confirm the Peace of Augsburg. In response to the Protestant Union, the Catholic League was formed in 1609, gradually moving towards a large-scale European conflagration, namely the 30 Years' War, with Christian denominational freedom at the heart of the conflict, among other things. The commencement of the war is traced to 1618, which ended in 1648 with the signing of the Peace of Westphalia. The salient terms of the Peace of Westphalia, which are relevant for our discussions, are as follows. Let me have some tea. So, the salient terms of the Peace of Westphalia, which creates the concept of nation states as opposed to civilizational states. The Peace of Augsburg, this is number 1. The Peace of Augsburg of 1555, along with the principle of Caius Regio Eius Religio, Jusca del Musca Religion, was recognized, strengthening the concept of religion-defined state sovereignty, with a defined territory having an official Christian denomination being identified as the realm of a particular state over which princes and rulers held dominion. Thenceforth, princes would have the right to determine the official Christian denomination of their states without interference from the Roman Catholic Church or what remained of the Holy Roman Empire after the war. What needs to be appreciated is that the Peace of Westphalia did not result in the creation of secular sovereign states as we understand them today, that is, states without an official religion. On the contrary, the war itself was fought for the right to have an official state religion. More specifically, to choose a state dominion, to choose a state denomination within the Christian religion without having to dance to the writ of the Roman Catholic Church. Number 2. These sovereign states had exclusive rights over their subjects on both secular and religious matters without having to suffer the interference of the empire or other sovereign states. This allowed them to levy taxes and raise armies of their own, which became a priority, especially after the experience of the 30 Years' War, notwithstanding the precedent of diplomatic negotiations to resolve disputes and conflicts set by the Peace of Westphalia. In short, the importance of preservation of the balance of power was understood. Also, these states could enter into alliances with each other, with the exception of alliances against the empire. This is number 3. Those Christian citizens whose denominational affiliation was different from that of the state were guaranteed the freedom of conscience to practice in private and limited rights to practice in public. In other words, religious minorities in this context were denominational minorities from within the same religion, namely Christianity, and their ability to practice their denominational faith in public was contingent upon the goodwill of the state and therefore the majority of the denomination. And 4. Calvinism, which was previously not recognized as one of the permanent denominations of Christianity under the Peace of Augsburg of 1555, was included as the third official permanent denomination. Given the drastic truncation, if not complete elimination, of both the papacy and the overlordship of the Holy Roman Empire, Pope Innocent X issued a papal bull, Zel Domu, which declared the Westphalian peace treaties null, void, invalid, iniquitous, unjust, damnable, reprobate, inane, empty of meaning and effect for all time. Anticipating this papal tantrum, the Peace of Westphalia contained a clause that preemptively stated that the Pope's protests would not render the treaties void. So let's read this part once more. This is hilarious. Given the drastic truncation, if not complete elimination, of both the papacy and the overlordship of the Holy Roman Empire, Pope Innocent X issued a papal bull, Zel Domu, or it's probably Domus, D-O-M-U-S, which declared the Westphalian peace treaties quote unquote, null, void, invalid, iniquitous, unjust, damnable, reprobate, inane, empty of meaning and effect for all time. Anticipating this papal tantrum, the Peace of Westphalia contained a clause that preemptively stated that the Pope's protest would not render the treaties void. That the Christian Peace of Westphalia laid the foundation for sovereign nation-states is evident from the definition of the state in the Montevideo Convention on the Rights and Duties of States, 1933. Article 1 of the said convention reads as under: the state as a person of international law should possess the following qualifications: A permanent population, B, a defined territory, C, a government, D, capacity to enter into relations with other states.